The Short Game is listener-supported on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join us on our Discord, head to theshortgame.net or patreon.com/theshortgame. Welcome back to The Short Game. This is a show about short video games, games that respect your time. I am Reagan Kelly, and I am joined by my very cool co-hosts,
Laura Nash
and Shane Kelly.
And this week is a bit of a special sort of topic episode for us. So our normal format is book club style. We pick a video game, usually a short game, 10 hours or less is our usual limit, and we all play it and we talk about it in some depth. This is not going to be that. Week before last, we did our Game of the Year of 2019. And that raised a lot of interesting, that's the end of a decade. It raised a lot of interesting conversations, especially on our Discord, which is where we all chat about the show and talk about what we're playing. And by the way, of course, if you're one of our Patreon supporters, you can join us there and have that conversation with us too. But we started talking about what the 2010s, or I've heard people start calling the decade the 20-teens, which I actually really like, so I'm going to go with that. What did the 20-teens mean for them in video games? Or what was the game of the 20-teens? What was the, and that's all tricky to talk about. I was thinking about, is there a game of the decade? No, that's impossible. There's just simply no way to do that. Even a game of the year is a bit of a stretch. But we did start having a conversation where we got into talking about indie games specifically, which are a lot of what we cover, and what the sort of arc of indie games has been across the decade. And it was a really interesting talk, and I thought we wanted to kind of bring that out into the podcast and talk about a decade worth of indie games and what that indie game scene has looked like since 2010.
Yeah, we are not professional video game curators. We are not game journalists who've had a million different Steam codes in our library. We are just very interested, though, in what the overall arcs of the last 10 years, because it's kind of, for me personally, it's me gaming as an adult and really gaming in general, because I was not allowed video games as a child. Joke's on you, parents. But to me, really, I think indie games and kind of small independent games have gotten a lot more media coverage this decade. And it's been really interesting to look back and think how much stuff we took for granted and thought were just the way things were. Once you get past the big AAA titles, there's a lot of little arcs and a lot of little engines that could, and some of them could not, unfortunately. There's some tragedy in the 20-teens.
Yeah, it's really neat, though. It's a decade that coincided very much with my, becoming really engaged with video games. Like, I obviously played a lot of games as a kid. It was something that I spent a lot of time on. Then I sort of fell away from it a little bit, but I sort of came back to games pretty seriously during the beginning of, or a little bit before, the 2010s. And it was looking back over a whole decade of it, it's really quite interesting.
Yeah, I always played a lot of games, but I wasn't really as much, a dedicated gamer until this kind of decade. So, we had some consoles and things like that, but Reagan and I, especially, you and I coming into this decade, were more into like tech generally than games.
That's true.
And we're actually more into podcasting than games, which is, we did a lot of podcasting back then. And we were also really into Apple stuff just in general. Like, we were kind of design nerds and liked the arts and stuff like that. And that's, so all of that kind of set the stage for me coming into the 2010s, because in 2009, I thought the biggest thing in games ever had happened, which was the creation of the App Store. And I rightly understood that it would change everything for games, but I had no idea at the time what it was going to do. Because I knew that opening the floodgates to anyone who could code or make, who could create something like this, to be able to put software right onto, these incredible devices that were, people were realizing are going to be everywhere. That's it. That's the future of games. That's what I thought coming into 2010. And we had been used to never having any games because we were all on the Mac, but also 2010 is the year that Steam came to the Mac. So this was the start of this decade felt like the dawning of a new age of games to me.
Yeah, I want to back up a little bit before the beginning of the decade and sort of set the stage for where things were. Obviously, Shane mentioned that the App Store happened, I think it was 2008, and that was a very big deal. But that's part of a big pattern that was happening right at the end of the previous decade, where these digital distribution and digital marketplaces were opening up and making it possible for games to be available in more places more easily and distributed by more people. There's always been indie games. There's always been, bedroom coders. You go back to the early days of computing, and most games were created by, one person probably working on their own, usually not in a professional work for hire capacity, but more like as a project that then they would sell either themselves or very more often just as a boxed product through a publisher. But a lot of those games were in a way what you'd consider an indie game with a publisher. But that sort of fell away the more complex games got. It felt like in the early days of in the later days of the 2000s that suddenly that was returning. That there were people out there who were able to, build games mostly on their own, which felt like a surprise at the time, and distribute them through these things that were starting to become available. So just at the end of the decade, the App Store, obviously, big one. Steam was beginning to allow third-party games on their platform, and even consoles had a little crack in the door.
Xbox
there.
Live Arcade was really big.
Yeah, and the thing to me that I remember being a huge deal since I was in the casual game industry at the time was because games were suddenly on phones, everyone had access to games and everyone was curious about games. So it kind of broke down this gamer label. I honestly still don't call myself a gamer. And until I'd been recording this podcast for 4 years and someone called me that, I was like, who is a gamer? But the idea that games being on your phone and was so accessible made this gaming is something that everyone does.
It really normalized it.
Started to become a narrative. It really normalized it. And I think also you start getting a little bit more prestige. I mean, MoMA put a bunch of games, I think 14 into their library in 2012. There were these kind of little baby steps towards games might be important. And I think this proliferation, this kind of accessibility, you don't have to go into a store to get a game. You can just impulse buy, really started to change that. So that's kind of, to me, what the early decade was I can get games easily, and games don't necessarily have that barrier to entry they once did. I don't have to download an emulator and put a ROM on it or go out and buy a piece of hardware. I already have the hardware. The games work on what I have.
Yeah, and you don't even have to visit a store. It's just there. When the iPhone first started making software available, I remember thinking are they going to have... Am I going to go into an Apple store and buy a piece of software in a box and install it on my phone through iTunes? I literally thought I was going to be doing that before they announced how the App Store was going to work. And that's not how things work.
The internet and Steam, going into 2010, we're obviously very much a thing. There was no walled garden around, who could install what on a PC, right? Or
we knew how to
go online and download software from the internet. And, a lot of it was games. It was out there. But what the kind of the rise of the App Store showed is okay, if you have this really compelling hardware and you put it together with an easy way to get software onto it from anyone and just make the barrier between the developer and the customer really low, people are going to be very willing to try new things. And so the number of people playing games and all that stuff just explodes. But then we get into 2010 and already the cracks are kind of starting to show there. Like the App Store itself has I guess a few good years, right? 2010 is when we have the iPads release, and there's this explosion of creativity on there, but there's a lot of that lowering of that barrier. I remember there being like a few years where like, oh, somebody made a fart app, that's funny. But then like a couple years go by and there's like 50 fart apps and you have to scroll past them to find the games you want to play. You know, like that becomes the problem that you face. And I don't think anyone expected that.
Yeah. Do you guys remember what sorts of games you were playing around the beginning of the decade, around 2010?
I do. So 2010 was the year that like Steam for Mac came out. And to me, the stuff I was trying to play on my computer, a lot of that was stuff that was kind of hard to get, like running on a Mac, stuff like Limbo, Super Meat Boy, and VVVVV all came out that year. So there was a lot of like these different reimaginings of the platformer. A lot of this indie explosion was like people bringing new creativity to this like very core gamer console associated genre of the like side scroller platformer. And so there was a lot of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was playing a ton on Xbox Live Arcade because I lived in Seattle. Guess what? Microsoft company store subsidized my purchases. So I was playing a ton of indie games on that. Like, I was still playing a lot of Castle Crashers and Braid, like things that were featured in Indie Game the Movie, which came out a little after, but was covering that time period. Like generally I was playing emulator games for work, and Xbox Live Arcade. I didn't even know about Steam for several years.
I did not. Yeah, I definitely wasn't on Steam at that point yet. I didn't have anything that would play any game. Like Steam for Mac came out in 2010, but and I think I downloaded it and played around with it, but my Mac was very low end at that point. I think that at the time I was mostly playing games on the PS3. I had a PS3 that I was very excited to get when the PS3 was pretty new. It was very expensive, but I bought it, and along with my long-suffering then girlfriend, who for some reason decided to split a PS3 with me. What a
that seems like an interesting move.
Right? Yeah, no, I was like, oh, but we'll be able to watch Blu-rays together. You know how these things go. I ended up moving to New York in 2009. I think I bought her out of her half of the PS3 so I could take it with me. And I was playing a lot of games on that. So, we're talking about, I think around that time I would have been playing like Portal 2, not really indie stuff. I can't think of any indie games that I would have been playing around the actual turn of the decade. I think that happened for me a little bit later.
Yeah, a lot of phone games. I'm looking at my purchase history. Tap Tap Revenge 3 is not an indie game at all, but things like Dark Nebula was coming out. Like there was a lot of little, lost games. And lest we forget, Plants vs. Zombie came out, I think, in 2010. So again, not super indie, but wasn't a huge thing yet.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I did have an iPhone at some point in 2010. I'm pretty sure a little before that. And I think my first iPhone was the 3GS, and I played a fair number of games on it. I think the game I most remember playing on my iPhone 3GS, my first iPhone, was probably Spider: The Secret of Bryce Manor, which I remember just being absolutely in love with.
Yeah, that was a terrific game. I think the game I remember on my phone the most from that year was The Incident. Who made that? I forget. That was, I don't know. The Incident was fun.
Yes, it was.
But we could all get games without really knowing anything about them, which was pretty cool.
And I was just starting to be aware of, like, really starting to try to follow games. Before that point, I think my awareness of games was mostly through blogs. Like, I think around this time in my life, I was, mostly engaging with online media by doing things like reading Boing Boing. And the games that I was playing would be things like Boing Boing wrote an article about like, hey, did you know that this game Portal exists and it's good? And I'd be like, that sounds interesting. I wonder if I can play that on my PlayStation 3. Oh, turns out I can. Okay, cool. That's pretty much how things went for me back in around that time period. And so around 2010 was when I was starting to get more engaged. I was reading Touch Arcade every day. I was like trying to find new games, and the idea of like indie games as a thing was also starting to bubble up in at least my consciousness. I know that phrase has been around longer than that. And obviously, like, it was definitely in the public mind by the time Indie Game, the movie, came out. Think about the phrase indie games. It's essentially trying to play on the idea of like indie movies. Indie movies was a concept I was very familiar with by this point, right? Like that was, and so the idea of indie games sort of clicked. It was like, okay, these are games that are made in the same way as indie movies and mean some of the same things that indie movies meant to me in the 2000s. So like, made by a small team, made on a small budget, and usually more willing to be artistically adventurous because of their ability to take risks that big budget stuff couldn't. That's what like indie game says or said at the time. I think it still sort of does, but like I think that was more of a statement back then.
Yeah, to me, the difference is indie game then kind of was like, we are really on our own. And here it is, we are on our own, and then we found a publisher. It feels more like an indie game. Like you don't have to necessarily do all of the like every indie. Like Nintendo just served me an ad on Instagram saying best indies of the year, and Ori and the Blind Forest was on it, and I was like, is that an indie? It's got a huge team behind it. Like indie doesn't like it's almost become a meaningless term in some way, but it used to mean small.
Indies is more about budget than about like structure now, in a way. It's funny.
But I don't even know if it means that anymore. I feel like it used to mean like small.
That's true.
And now it means something else.
Well, we'll talk about this when we get to the end of the decade and like figure out what indie still means, if anything. But yeah, I think about it in terms of like specifically like okay, I think a really important example here is like Minecraft, right? Minecraft is an indie game. It was when it first came out. This was a bedroom coder project by who? I thought the game dropped out of space, right? But no, I can't snark on early 2010s Notch, right? Like he went down a dark path, but we got to look at him as a really interesting example.
So many people in games went down a dark path.
So many
2010s.
people, yeah, the
2010s.
decade.
That's the story of the 2010s. A dark path.
There's a lot of milkshake ducks in 2010s.
Yeah, but so like Minecraft is a global phenomenon, the likes of which most of us have never seen before and will never see again in our lives. It is a thing that went from a weird Java applet to one of the biggest multimedia brands in the world. And 2010 was when this game went to alpha. So it wasn't even out exactly yet at this point, although it had become a thing that you could buy, and it was starting to resemble what it would later become. And it was about as indie as you get. This was something that, like, it was not on Steam. You had to go to Notch's website and buy this game for, I think it was $15. And you then download a Java jar file to your computer and run it. Like, it was as indie as it gets. And, like, I mean, maybe we check in on Minecraft a little bit as we go through the rest of the decade, because holy crap, that decade was kind to Minecraft and its developer, who shall remain nameless, I guess.
Yeah, Minecraft hit it wasn't even hard to say at the perfect time, because I mean it was such a perfect idea. It was interesting enough that it was enthralling for kids and really people of all ages. But especially for kids, and it was innocuous enough that no parent really objected to it, but it was like expansive and complex enough to just like really be that kind of perpetual game that we were talking about, the forever game that was kind of starting to rise here for a certain generation of gamer. And I really loved it. I played a hell of a lot of it.
Yeah, me too. I remember building great structures in Minecraft with you as a great way to hang out. It was a nice cross-country way to hang out and chill and bash blocks together.
Yeah.
And, it was a beautiful thing.
It still is. I would still love to return to our castle one day. But yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to knock Minecraft as an idea, because it's one of the most brilliant games of all time. But like you said, the 2010s are going to reveal kind of some social issues in the gaming community as that community, I guess, kind of begins to really assemble itself around like online communities. Because before that it was not as well defined, and people definitely weren't looking at, maybe this is related to the idea of the indie game becoming this artistic movement, which happens in the 2010s. Like in any artistic movement, people really do start to look and say like, okay, well, if we are taking a look at this genre artistically, what is it actually saying?
Well, you're talking about this kind of personal story and the artistic message. Like games became part of this auteur theory where it was you suddenly knew the names of individuals behind game titles. And sure, that was happening to some extent with a lot of the early designers, but everyone knew them.
I think before that, I literally only knew who like Will Wright and Kojima were.
Right. Like, but now, the media was picking up like, oh, this game was a hit and it was made by these two people or this one person. Like, this is Jenova Chen. Like, people got pedestalized and some of them were able to stay on there and some of them fell off very quickly because once you start taking like a single person, then suddenly like, oh, they're not just the game they made. They're an individual and people are flawed and some people are more flawed than others. So it's kind of like this combo of this like, oh, this person is an artist. They're a genius. They're a businessman. Oh, are they a horrible person? We don't know. We never asked. It's all those things together. And that's kind of like, you can't have one without the other. Like you can't have the rise of these like giant success stories on a few people without kind of, having them fall under the weight of that fame in some way. At least like the difference between this and what happened, it happens every time. Like it happened in Victorian literature. It happened in movies. It's just like it happened a lot faster in video games. It used to take 20 years or 70 years for people to kind of get called out. And now it takes 2, 3.
Yeah.
Just so much faster now. Sorry, that was my like auteur theory lecture. Apologies to everybody. I'll take my horn rim glasses off now.
No, that's absolutely like an important component of this, and it also kind of dovetails with like the. I mean, I don't want to be too much of a downer, but like some of the incredibly terrible shit that happened in the video game culture during the
darkness.
We talk about like auteur theory. There were a lot of people who are these auteurs. One of them was Zoe Quinn, creating artwork, incredibly personal game art, totally on her own. A person who probably, if she had been making that same stuff a decade prior, no one would have known who she was, and no one would have played her stuff. But Depression Quest got some press, and then I'm not gonna. I wouldn't even be able to give you a proper timeline of the Gamergate bullshit, but like that's where we got to in terms of gaming culture.
So Depression Quest came out in 2013, which is the same year that Anita Sarkeesian started the Tropes versus Women in Games series. So I think that 2013 is specifically the flashpoint here for Gamergate. And so around that time, that's, you've got the release of both the 6th gen consoles, Xbox One, PS4. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is people, it sounds pretty recent for me to say like 2013, but video games still had this very weird place in the culture then. Like if you think about it, it seems weird now to look back at a time where like, the president of the United States is saying like, let's study violence in video games and see if that leads to school shootings and stuff like that. There was a lot of like discussion around like what is the effect of games on our culture, still going on in that time. And so when Zoe Quinn created this game, Depression Quest, it gets covered because it's an interesting topic, right?
Yeah, people are looking for that like games as art angle too. So
yeah. We were still arguing with I don't know at this point whether Ebert was dead, but I'm just going to say he was, and that we were still arguing with his ghost about this.
But our Marvel movies art? That's the question now.
Yeah, we've moved on past our games art, and now we're talking about
our movies. Even
our movies art is art.
Our TV shows just long long movies. Anyway.
Yes, all of the answers to all of these questions are yes. Let's move on. But like, yeah, we started seeing games culture being a microcosm and unfortunately a sort of a preview of culture at large. Previously, games culture was at best a footnote and at worst a joke. Games culture was like letters printed in the back of a magazine, right? But like now, starting in around 2012 with things like Twitch coming out. Twitch came out in like the beginning of 2012, and obviously YouTube had already been very big, but video game content on YouTube was starting to just absolutely drive the conversation around video games. The culture of like, what does it mean to be interested in games was taking a turn. And it's like, it's not so much that this stuff wasn't there, it's that there's a different way of communicating about games now. And it meant that like we were seeing these aspects of game culture that we hadn't previously seen, or at least I hadn't previously seen. And
I mean, all that positivity we had at the beginning about all of this accessibility and new people playing games and like, the Wii had been out for a little bit, like the phone, all of these things of these easy casual games or accessible games, like, and then the gatekeeping happened.
Yeah. There was definitely like a feeling in those early days of the 2010s, like that, that things like phone games and Wii games were some people felt these are the future, and other people felt these are the future, and we're fucking pissed about it because I like my existing style of playing games, and had this and also it's easy to, if you think back to the decade before that, like I don't want to totally minimize the fact that like if you were a video game playing person, like a game fan, I don't love the word gamer, here we go, but if you were a gamer in the 2000s, everything about the way that games were moving might have felt to some people like they're coming for my games, right? Like there's there people saying that these games that you play. I have
kind of a counterpoint though. Mm-hmm. Fuck those guys.
Well, okay.
Great counterpoint.
Look, I'm totally with you. I am totally with you. I don't know. We were set up for a bad time,
and it would have been a really bad time if not a shining light
came forth in April 2014.
Yes, it would have been like, a terrible time if it weren't for the salvation of games. April 15th, 2014, the illustrious founding of the Short Game Podcast.
Mm-hmm. A banner for good. Truly.
Can I talk a little bit about where that? I mean, I've talked before this show, like where the show came from. But can I talk like very briefly about like why I started the show around 2014? Does that matter?
We don't know what you want to say specifically here, so you tell us if it matters.
There's not much to say really. It's just that 2014 was a time where like I finally had a PC and a Steam account, right? And it was after I got a PC and a Steam account that I realized, oh hey, there are games out there that I want to play. So many more games that I want to play than I'll ever be able to play. Even then, it seemed the backlog on my Steam account would be cute by today's comparison, right? Like, but at the time, it seemed like this unbelievable, pile of riches, right? And there was just so much to talk about, and we were already a few years into that sort of indie game boom, right? And so I had, I was going through and playing all of those games that had come out since 2010, and I was just very excited to talk about them. And I was standing around the Apple store with Nate, and we were just shooting the shit about them, and really wanted to talk about them and do something with that, and roped in Shane, and very shortly afterwards roped in Laura, and we all. Well,
I kind of bullied my way on there partially because of all the video culture garbage. I was like, I like these guys. I think there needs to be a lady voice on this podcast. I will sneak in and then make myself a space. And you guys were like, yes, please.
Can I just say, such a relief. Like, thank God for you, Laura.
Oh, thank you. That's really
Your
why
mind games worked.
I did, but I was basically like, hi guys, I am you would like me on your podcast? You're like, yes, I would. Like,
yes. Yeah, I'd say like I remember some of the like It was very early in the podcast. Like the bullshit surrounding Gamergate started in 2013. So like very shortly
and you
before.
guys were so careful. You guys were like, "Hi, Laura. You don't have to, but if you'd like to say something," and I was like, "I don't want to talk about it." You're like, "Okay, cool, great."
Yeah, like I didn't.
You guys were wonderful.
At that point, I really didn't know how to talk about this stuff. Like I particularly, in quote unquote public, right? Like I when Gamergate started, it was so confusing. I mean, this is weird to say now, but like I didn't understand what the controversy was. Every time I tried to read into it, it just seemed impossibly dumb. Like to the point where I couldn't understand what was going on. Like I was like, wait, why are people upset? And you had people on one side saying, "Oh, it's because of blah," and those people seemed almost immediately dismissible because they seemed like assholes. But also,
it's about ethics in games journalism,
right? Like it was very easy to immediately dismiss those people as assholes, and that was a correct choice. Thank you very much. But also, like, it was a very confusing time. Like, I couldn't figure out why this was happening. Like, I think with time, I've been able to like kind of get a little bit more of a handle on like what was happening in the culture. Like, why did this happen? Why are all these people so incredibly set on this incredibly stupid idea? Yeah, it and that was just the beginning of like me
larger
being
troll
baffled
culture.
at the entire like. Basically, it took me a long time to get my head around like Republicans and the right wing and the alt-right and Gamergate. I thought I understood like people before this, and 2013, 14, 15 was a time when I was really realizing that like I had a really small view, right? I didn't understand what was going on under the surface of sort of American culture and world culture generally at the time. Like the rise of Gamergate, the rise of the alt-right caught me completely by surprise. Like my politics today and my understanding of things today is so different than it was back then. Like that was just a real time of confusion for me.
I have no good transition statement, but I do want to move on for people who have just been like, please, Gamergate, we are going to talk about other topics,
yes.
But we needed to give it its due.
Yes,
we
indeed.
were talking about, I tried to get us onto the illustrious short game.
You did. We did try to lift out of the mire.
Let's talk about PewDiePie. Just kidding.
Oh, God.
Okay, let's talk in a positive way. Like, YouTube and streaming culture made a lot of Let's Play. Like, there was a lot more, like, watching people play video games as an activity. A lot of silly, stupid games became really popular, like Nate's fave, I Am Bread. And what's the one where you, like, have no legs and you have, like, a hammer?
Oh, Getting Over It with Ben Foddy?
Yep, that one.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole
That was a little
genre.
later, I think, right?
That was a lot more recent.
Octodad was, like,
A
very
lot later,
start of the
yeah.
decade right there.
Yeah, and things like, I think early one would be like Goat Simulator and other things like that. As well as things like, especially Five Nights at Freddy's, which is a bit of a different kind of thing. But like, I think that was another big thing we saw rise in the middle of the decade was like games that maybe aren't designed to find an audience based on a polished trailer, a good pitch, and a nice page on Steam, but instead are designed to attract an audience via being whatever the like YouTube version of telegenic is, right? Like they're games that like work well on streams, games that are basically there to be hype men for a streamer, right? Or like to set up situations where streamers on Twitch and YouTube can shine, and by reflection shine light on the game.
That's still going on. Pikuniku, which we covered last year, I have recently learned that they got the vast majority of their referral audience from people playing it on streams because it's adorable and funny looking.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes total sense. It's a very cute game. But like there's some games like Five Nights at Freddy's is the one that baffled me the most at first because it's a game that, it's very basic. It's I think it's built in Game Maker or some other or like Click Team Fusion, one of these fairly basic game maker. Not to denigrate anybody using those tools, which can be used for really amazing
ugly,
things.
And it's weird and it's kind of funny. But if you watch,
but it's full of jump scares.
If you watch somebody on YouTube doing a Let's Play of it, and they make, funny voices. I guess it's entertainment.
Yeah,
I never
watching
liked
somebody
it, but
freak
the
out
kids
on
seem to.
YouTube is
I'm
potentially a good time. Yeah. So, and that built from what was essentially like a really, really cheap looking indie game made by a single dude and released on Steam. I believe on Steam. I'm not even sure about that. To being, something where you can go and buy sweatpants in Walmart that have the characters on them today. Like years later. There's like, if you look up the Five Nights at Freddy's Wikipedia page, which I do every week out of sheer confusion, there are so many games listed on that page that I have no idea what they are. There's like 5 or 6 mainline games and like 4 or 5 spin-offs. And we're talking about within like there's been like more than one Five Nights at Freddy's game per year since they became a thing.
I have no way to transition away from Five Nights at Freddy's either, but I desperately want to.
Consider us transitioned. So what would you like to talk about, Shane?
I would like to talk about some of the like incredible games that came out around the like middle of the decade. So like starting in 2015, I just want to hit a few off my calendar here. 2015, Undertale, Her Story. 2016, Pokemon Go, Firewatch. 2017, Breath of the Wild on the Nintendo Switch. We're talking about
not an indie game.
Not an indie game.
Still a landmark.
Very true.
I don't care. I really liked it.
Yeah. There's so many like new ideas. The big explosion of like YouTube culture and stream culture. I mean, it's sort of an innovation, right? It's partly cultural, but it's also partly just like a game marketing and also just tech innovation. And there's other like weird things that seem like these big ideas that came up in the 2010s. It's harder to put dates on these, but like a big one would be episodic games. I'm going to try and put a link in the show notes. I read a really good article at Waypoint this week that was about sort of the rise and fall of episodic games, which is a very 2010s thing. Early in the decade, we started seeing, along with the indie game explosion, we started seeing incredibly popular stuff in a sort of an episodic format. So like maybe a little earlier, maybe before the beginning of the decade, you saw people like Valve trying this with the episodes of Half-Life 2. They didn't quite hit the mark, but like we started seeing actual successes in terms of episodic games, things like The Walking Dead and other Telltale stuff. And that model seemed super, super promising at the beginning of the 2010s. And now we've seen a lot of really high profile, both critical and sort of market failures in terms of episodic games. Things like the new Hitman, or not new Hitman, but like Hitman, the one before the most recent Hitman, was done in an episodic format. Critical success, but they switched away from that episodic format for the sequel because apparently it didn't do particularly well or didn't quite hit what they were expecting financially. And there's been a lot of other games that would have been, planned for this episodic format, especially things sort of emulating the Telltale style, where that's been kind of falling flat. You can look at things like Life is Strange. The first one did pretty well, but Life is Strange, the second season, which has just recently concluded, I don't think we have like actual numbers, but from what I understand, it's been a bit of a financial failure, even though it's been a critical success. And there's a few reasons for that, but I think there's a strong indication that like episodic games were something that was like hot at the beginning of the 2010s and feels almost dead now. It seems like that's not something people are going to be doing going into the next decade. As
we eventually cover Kentucky Route Zero, which has covered the entire decade. I think there's been like a lot of different people trying. I mean, trend of the decade, Kentucky Route Zero gets released. But I think that episodic game ideas seem like a really good idea because you could get ongoing payment. People didn't expect it all at once, but it also kind of lines up with the rise of people getting forever games. You get early access, you get updates for free all the time. So like having, new chapters that were just an hour or two even if it was a reduced cost, like people tended to wait for the whole season to get out, or they waited for a price drop. Like people kind of just didn't want that episodic. They didn't want to keep, waiting on the next story drip. Because like I don't read a novel a chapter at a time over the course of a year. So it's really hard to play episodic games that way.
The concept of like games that you kind of release out on a continuous or a drip feed basis is kind of this other innovation that we also talked about that was super successful, which, I've got to give a shout out to my home away from home, Destiny. Games as a service are, I'll be home someday, Destiny. Trust me, I will, when I can find the time. I had a kid. But man, like the idea of like games as a service and the idea of episodic games is in a lot of ways really similar. It's like, okay, we're gonna continue to get money from you, the games customer, over time. But it works only for, so few have actually made it work. Like Destiny's one, not that many others that have made it work in that model.
Yeah, I mean, you look at something like Anthem trying explicitly to emulate that model, and it was a really fascinating, colossal failure. Go and read that piece. I can't remember the title off the top of my head now, but if you Google like, why did Anthem fail? I'm sure that incredibly good piece on the sort of inside the development hell of Anthem will pop up, and it is really something else.
And that also kind of links back to the other big. So a lot of these innovations, now that we're getting into it, I'm realizing are just all the same thing.
Yeah,
they're all just developers trying to figure out new ways to get people to pay for their games. And that gets back to the more problematic ones too, like the free to play games that have a really exploitative model where the puppy is going to frown at my 2-year-old and he's going to ask me to put $1 in so that the puppy smiles, on the App Store. So, no, sorry, nothing happened. There wasn't a Paw Patrol game on my phone. Oh boy, the Nintendo Switch came out.
Yes, and the Nintendo Switch, the savior of the mobile indie market.
Yeah.
So I won't get on too much into this, but like, the rise of in-app purchases and free-to-play kind of drowning out premium games on the App Store meant there were a lot of people who made money for a time exclusively on iOS and then couldn't make any more money. And guess who has saved them? The Switch. Some of them did not.
Sure,
Some of them went to go work at AAA
we've talked before, before about the idea of like the indie apocalypse, right? And that's an idea, that's a word that's gotten thrown around multiple times throughout the decade, right? So like, if you were to chart a path of indie games through the 2010s, you'd probably say that it starts with a sort of indie game boom of the early decade, and then you'd probably have a point somewhere on that line, and where is debatable. Maybe it's a whole bunch of points. And you'd probably write in next to it indie-pocalypse. It's just one of those words that got thrown around a lot when I think
came up a lot when we were discussing this topic on the Discord.
Right.
So again, shout out to the Short Game Discord.
Indeed.
The best place to talk about games on the internet.
Yes. And it's sort of, we've been talking before getting on the show about what the indie-pocalypse is, right? Because I think different people mean different things when they're talking about that. But essentially what everyone had their own indie-pocalypse. Every developer had their own indie-pocalypse when they realized that maybe the business plan that they formulated probably somewhere earlier in the decade wasn't going to function anymore in the environment that had developed by the mid or end of the decade, which was basically that that a lot of very competent, very good developers saw that there was a potential to not just make money in a mercenary sense, but like a real possibility to create the game that they've always wanted to put out into the world, and potentially not go utterly broke while doing it. And everyone rushed to do that. And many of them found by the middle or end of the decade that the market that they had hoped to sell through into was no longer there, because things were changing really fast. And a big part of that was just the fact that, when these marketplaces opened up so wide, they meant that there became, it was much harder to be visible And things like marketing became much more important and expensive for even the small indie games. Somebody like when Braid came out, I don't think he spent a lot of money on marketing. What he did was release the game on Steam. Some people played it. Enough people liked it. He talked to Microsoft, who was hungry to put a game on their console, managed to do that. I don't know for sure that he didn't spend money on marketing, but I don't think he spent a lot. But today, if you were to make a game like it and wanted to put it out there, it would be competing against dozens or hundreds of games that are also vying for that same attention. That people would be able to access in very similar ways. It's just a really, really different marketplace than it was. The Switch, like you mentioned, Laura, changed that conversation a bit, but mostly just because it had, I don't think there's anything necessarily about the Switch that makes it, that fixes the problem other than that it is a new market.
No. The only difference is that people will pay $15, $10, $5 for a game on the Switch, and they won't pay, a lot of people won't pay anything on a phone.
Right.
So I'm not saying that it's not a savior.
It's a small
it's just a new
release
marketplace.
Valve.
But it's a small release valve.
So we were talking earlier when we got onto the topic of the indie-pocalypse, and we wound up kind of comparing the indie-pocalypse to the video game crash of 1983 that everybody has heard about now, right? And so in 1983, a bunch of places like Atari everyone had made a console, and there was a bunch of games sitting on the shelves, and a lot of them were bad. And so consumers thought, well, maybe video games aren't that big of a deal. Maybe they're not. Maybe it was a fad. And next thing you know, Atari is burying hundreds of copies of E.T. in a landfill in the desert. And everything stays dead for a few years, 2-3 years until Nintendo comes around, right? So, maybe this indie-pocalypse, there's some parallels there. We had the Switch come around and figure out how to get people to pay a few real Earth dollars for their entertainment. But if that's the case, I do kind of wonder, what is the Atari ET of mobile games? Like, when we did have this quote unquote indie-pocalypse, what was really what got buried in the desert?
What got buried was people, right? Like
companies.
Yeah. A lot of small.
A lot of companies got buried in the desert.
Out in the desert. And a lot of people who would have maybe who would have liked to make careers out of making games either didn't get to or went on to careers that were quite different than what maybe they would have been trying for. I guess I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but it wasn't like a bunch of Atari cartridges that got buried in the desert this time. It was a bunch of people's hopes and dreams.
Yep, I think that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, so I've been trying to kind of wrap my head around. I wasn't really involved that much in understanding the business of games during this period. I was still kind of getting aware of it, but so I kind of get that we had this app store with the race to the bottom prices. I remember that I even myself thought why would I pay more than $1 for a game or an app on my phone? And then there's this proliferation of free and free to play games. And, I remember how cluttered the app store storefront got and thinking, maybe the games are drying up on the app store and just thinking, I wasn't quite as clued into stuff like Touch Arcade as you were at the time, Reagan. I think I played Field Runners on my phone constantly all the way into 2012, so, but I do remember people being really, because I was starting to get onto PC when people were really starting to be concerned about Steam Greenlight, and that was really controversial, Yeah, and the number of games that were being released on PC was just exploding from around 2012 to around 2015, and so Steam Greenlight starts releasing, people really started to become concerned, looking at the App Store on mobile and saying, well, what if Steam becomes like this, right? What if there is no way to dig through all the clutter and find things that are actually worth playing? And in a lot of cases, like it kind of did become hard. And then we started looking around. I remember, what was it, around 20? It was actually right at 2010 when I guess it got founded, but it was later when I kind of got onto it, which is the idea of the Humble Bundle. Do you remember Humble Bundle becoming a thing? When did that really hit for you?
I remember being very excited about Humble Bundles around, this would have been probably 2011, 2012, because Humble Bundles were really what motivated me to build a gaming PC back at that time, because I realized part of it was just like these bundles would come up and maybe there'd be one game that I could actually play on my existing setup, but there'd be 4 others in the bundle that I thought, well, maybe I could play that if I ever upgrade my PC or if I, do whatever else I needed to do. And that was a really big motivating factor for me at the time, because it's so cheap. You'd be an idiot not to do it at the time. It felt like.
Well, they managed to like find this interesting space kind of in between that kind of race to the bottom pricing, which is like, okay, all code is $1. In oftentimes, like you're actually even paying less or nothing. Like they had like pay what you want kinds of sales, right?
Right? Pay a little bit more to get the one game you might have heard of.
Yeah, exactly. And then you wind up so they created this space of like, somehow yet again managing to carve out a little marketplace in this like morass of junk like shovelware.
I don't want to cast aspersions on the probably very good people with good intentions at Humble Bundle, because like part of the whole thing of Humble Bundle was that it was essentially
charity.
Yeah, it's a charity. It's a way of raising money for charity by getting developers essentially to donate their games, which maybe they wouldn't have been. Hopefully, they get a bunch of basically free marketing out of it. Hopefully, by donating their games or at a very low cost to them to these bundles. But the problem is that it creates this marketplace for these games where it devalues the games. The idea is like, oh well, this game isn't worth $5 because at one point it was in a Humble Bundle for 5 cents, right? And maybe there's even still bunches of keys floating around for it or something like that. And it kind of cloaks this, I think, kind of problematic effect that it has on the market in its charity, right? Like it's unimpeachable because it's a charity. So no one was really thinking about like, what is this doing to the market of video games? Now, it definitely had a positive effect too. Like I mentioned, it got me into the Steam marketplace in a way that I hadn't been before. It got me into PC gaming in a way that I hadn't been before, and excited about it because like suddenly with almost no outlay of money, I had this massive library of games that was just waiting for me to play once I had a place to play them. And I think that's probably a story that a lot of people kind of lived during that time.
And it was kind of around here, like 2012 to 2015-ish, where people saw like the number of games that were coming out, like ballooning, and like these, the overall like price people paid for a game when they bought it, like taking a nosedive. And they also simultaneously were seeing stuff like these big name indie games coming out, like the stuff that got a lot of publicity. And those were starting to have like real marketing budgets behind them. And there was this idea for a while of like a AAA game being like an indie game that like actually had business sense and like corporate marketing savvy and all that stuff behind it. And like the indie market is going to just become another AAA market. But then again, now they're competing with AAA games. So maybe it'll just all go away. That was like the mindset around this kind of idea of the indie apocalypse. And what to me, like a trend like that, sure, if these trends continue, but a trend like that can't really continue forever, right?
Yeah, none of the if you follow these trends, they always either go up eventually into the stratosphere or down to the earth, and like that's never been the story. Like if the trend of the 1983 video game crash had continued, we would all be playing with sticks and rocks right now.
Yeah, and your average game consumer, sure, they'll play a game that's like a penny, but are they going to play 10 games for 10 pennies? I don't know. game consumers' leisure time inexplicably remains flat.
I mean, it used to be like, hey, is everyone just going to play free Flash games on their computer instead of buying things? Like, there's always going to be a threat.
In the face of booming workforce productivity, and even in the flood of nearly identical platformers for a penny, gamers were finding what the good stuff was. And so ultimately, it kind of turned out to not be it was a real problem because there were a lot of people that, the market did change and people kind of had to change their careers and expectations in a lot of ways. But
yeah, I don't want to contradict the lived experience of anyone who suffered personal or financial hardship during the indie apocalypse, right? Like if it affected you, it affected you. But like for
good news, indie life goes on.
Right, life went on, particularly for the game player, if not maybe for all of the people in the industry. Like the disruption was, I would say, much less felt than the 83. Well, I wasn't around for that one, so I can't say exactly what it felt like to be a game player in 1983. But I gotta imagine that, like, from the game player perspective, this dip felt less than the 83 one for sure, because it good stuff continued to come out at pace during this whole period.
So it's funny that even as the business story was all this, we're hearing indie apocalypse, we're hearing about all this struggle in the industry, all the problems of churn and people just overworking themselves and all like the horrible conditions of the gaming industry. On the player side, you're just seeing so many games. Like, people talk about peak TV. There's too much good TV to watch. Like, there is yearly, we used to have to struggle to find short games to fill the schedule. Not anymore. Like, it seems like there's just...
Yeah, that hasn't been a problem in a few years.
That hasn't been a problem for years. There's just so many games coming out on so many levels from so many different channels. Like, if we wanted to have a super indie, tiny $1 to $5 an itch podcast, we could be doing that. Like,
hey, and if anybody has that podcast, hit me up. I want to listen to it.
Oh yeah, and there's just like this crazy democratization. Like, the tools to play games have never been cheaper. No, the tools to make games have never been cheaper.
But also play games. That's a totally
and play
valid,
games.
like,
to be honestly,
a Nintendo Switch is $200-ish. Like, if you take inflation into account, every console today is such a value. And that's not even thinking about phones, which most people just sort of, not to discount the fact that phones are expensive, they are, but people just have them, right? So, like, there's...
And if you don't have money for a console of your own, you can watch them for free.
That's true. Yeah, you can go on YouTube and watch somebody
and you can
play
be just as knowledgeable
game
about Overwatch, not playing a single minute.
Yeah, it's been a wild decade. I don't know. Is there any other like
true
big big shifts or big trends that we want to talk about across the period of the 2010s?
We've talked a little bit about it, but I want to just give a shout out to the explosion of games coverage. Games aren't we're getting like little footholds into mainstream media, but like they're covering esports and stuff, which is important. But it is easier than ever, if you haven't heard of a game, to find someone talking about it.
That's really
whether or not
true.
That's a credible source. You can still find someone to talk about it.
Yeah, I think the biggest change for me is like, so things like blogs existed back in the 2010s. Like I mentioned that, like, I got a lot of my gaming news at the time, not from gaming sites, but from sort of more broad blog-like types of sites. But I think something that really has changed is that the way that games are covered by like actual gaming media has made a big shift from things like, if you look back then, we're talking about things like magazines still existed. Gaming websites were mostly these sort of like magazine-like publications. Maybe they were making like inches into video or what have you, but they were still in this sort of very editorial, voice of the of the business kind of vibe. And the 2010s was sort of the arc of games coverage really shifted towards personality-based coverage, which I immensely prefer. I just sort of find it much easier to sort of get to know a person who is a games critic and thinker about games, and sort of get to know them and their tastes and follow what they are interested in via a variety of different things. I'll find somebody I think is smart and follow them on Twitter and listen to their podcast and watch them on YouTube and go to their website and read their blog and all of these things. And that feels different from, getting going to IGN or getting a magazine in the mail, which was, I think, still a pretty dominant way of learning about new games even as late as like 2010.
So I've been doing a lot of interviews for work on how people look for new games, given this kind of insane environment we talk about. And a lot of people are saying things like Steamless. I look at curators. Like they're talking about like, I curate my games and share the games I like, and I expect people to do the same. I follow people I trust. I talk to people I trust. I look at people talking about it on Twitter. It's not just like a goose game that kind of everyone starts talking about. They kind of start listening to a couple voices. And it's interesting that as, discovery becomes a bigger and bigger problem as there's just more and more games out there. We're still kind of I look at the 20 people I follow that I trust, and people in Discord saying you should play this game, people emailing us. Like, we're still kind of looking at personal recommendations because it's not as if there's one monolithic property out there.
Yeah, it's just that personal
No one's telling us what to do anymore.
It's just that personal recommendations have now extended to YouTubers, podcasters, bloggers, all these other sort of parasocial
personal doesn't mean you know the person anymore, but you think you do.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, and it is like it's a big shift that happened it happened without me noticing it. But looking back on the decade, it feels really obvious. I don't really know how you where you draw those lines. There's definitely like early pioneers in that like I wasn't paying attention to, and it kind of just blindsided me that suddenly, oh wow, I guess this is what video games journalism is like now, right? And I think it's great. I really prefer it.
Yeah, and the other thing I just throw out as a trend, we gotta say, Kickstarter started in 2009.
Dang.
And that's been a huge trend of the decade.
Huge.
I don't have anything to say about that other than Kickstarter existed and changed the way we fund games, but it's kind of something you gotta at least give lip service to.
Yeah, well, as long as we're giving lip service to things, I'd like to pour one out for one of my favorite gaming trends that didn't make it.
Oh, please.
And that was 3D televisions.
Yeah.
Oh. Right around, remember? Right.
Have you ever actually played a video game on one, though? Like, I know that was a thing that Sony was pushing pretty hard, but by the time I had the hardware that would be required to do that, no one wanted to do it anymore.
Yeah, no, I had one game that I got to play through in 3D. It was that, God, I don't even remember the fucking name of it. It was one of this flagship Sony PS.
Would have been PS3. The PS4 does not.
Yeah, it was a PS3 FPS. It was like Aliens,
Resistance.
World War I.
Resistance.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I played Resistance in 3D.
Yeah, I never even did that. And that was one of those things that like Sony was pushing that hard. Sony even made a special PlayStation 3 branded TV that was 3D, and like it was gonna be the next big thing, right? You remember Avatar was out and everyone was like super excited about 3D
now
televisions.
You had the Blu-rays. Avatar was it though. Like I didn't own a copy of Avatar because they kept the Blu-ray real expensive, and so that's the only 3D thing I ever did.
Yeah, I didn't get a 3D capable TV until I was already pretty sure that wasn't for me. So, and I never even bought the glasses. Just has that extra tech in there that's never been turned on.
Yeah, but also in 2010 there was another tech that came out that was kind of before its time. And they've tried it again and again the whole decade, and they're still trying it. And people think it's the first time, like this year. And that's like game streaming services. In 2010, they came out with OnLive. Remember that one?
Yep.
OnLive was going to have its own hardware to do game streaming. And then, like around 2015, Sony tried to do the same thing, and they made their own subscription game streaming service. And now Google is doing it here at the end of the decade, and still nobody's managed to nail it.
Yeah, I think nobody's nailed it because the internet infrastructure in this country is shit, but also like the kinds of games that that I don't know, the kinds of games that will work on it are pretty specific. Like you sell that by saying like, oh, it's going to play the highest end stuff. You won't need to have this super high end gaming PC. We'll have something in the cloud that'll give you, pictures that will look real pretty and better than what you can do on your box at home. But at least with the current game design trends, the people that care most about the, fancy graphics are also the people that care most about being able to frag noobs at 120 FPS or whatever. I don't know. I maybe we can talk a little bit about projections for the coming decade, as much as we can think of them. But I don't know. I'm still very skeptical on game streaming. After a decade of failures, I don't see why we're going to start having successes yet. I don't think the tech and landscape has changed enough.
Maybe in 2030.
Maybe.
Yeah.
You want to talk about another tech thing that happened in this decade, Shane? After your 3D TV, this was the decade when VR became a thing.
Right. I thought that was the 80s.
I mean, you'd think, but like I was very surprised to see VR like become an actual commercial product that you could buy this decade. And I've been both pleasantly surprised and also kind of disappointed by where we're at with it, right? Like it's like PSVR is fine. It's fun to play, but it's still very niche and weird and kind of janky in many ways. Getting into a VR setup is still very expensive if you're doing something other than PSVR. Almost any of the other ones are pretty darn expensive. And there's all kinds of like compromises to those experiences. And it's the point where like here we are years after the introduction of VR, and Valve is introducing a brand new Half-Life game. And my first thought was, oh, dang, it's in VR. I guess I won't play that.
I will.
Well, it's been a very interesting decade, and it's been an interesting chat thinking back on it. I know we our conversation here focused a lot on like the broad strokes of things and not a lot on specific games or anything like that. So, if listeners have thoughts about what your game of the decade was, for example, or games that you think made a enormous impact across the decade, there's definitely a chat to be had there. Maybe join us on the Discord and we can talk about it. I'd also like to know if anybody has any predictions for what the next decade holds for indie games or video gaming generally. And I don't know. We're not great prognosticators. I don't have a crystal ball or anything, but I wondered if any of you guys had any thoughts for what's coming in the next decade.
Well, I actually am a 9th level spellcaster specializing in divination. So I will use my crystal ball and I will look forward into the next decade and I will say game streaming will be a thing by 2030. Feels like a safe bet.
That's a very good
Will
pick.
it be a successful thing by 2030?
I mean, it's a thing now.
Someone will be making money on it.
Mine's going to be a much easier prediction. I predict there's going to be a lot more silly, memeable, all ages games because everyone's going to look at Goose Game and go, why don't I have that? And before everyone was going, why don't I have Five Nights at Freddy's? They're going to learn they don't have to be violent. They just have to be mischievous. More dirtbag animals in the next decade because everyone's going to want to copy Goose Game.
And less dirtbag people, please. Less dirtbag people.
Oh, that would be great. More dirtbag animals, more fun mischief, and less horrible mischief.
All right.
So we have been naming Dirtbag of the Year. Did we name Dirtbag of the Decade?
I mean, the dirtbag of the year the last 3 years has been an animal, and I see no reason why this trend will not continue. It is the late 20-teens and onward trend is dirtbag animals, and I would love it to just continue onward into the 2020s.
Indeed. I guess my one prediction, and every time if you try to make a serious prediction, all anyone is ever really doing is like finding something they think is the future and trying to project it out, right? And for me right now, the most futuristic thing I've seen in video games in a little while is AI Dungeon 2. It felt like magic when I played it. If you haven't seen it, look it up. It's astonishing. And what I think is my prediction for the next decade would be that, do you remember back around the introduction of the Kinect? So here again, we're looking back at the decade that was. There was that demo called like Milo. And it was a sort of non-game thing that never actually came out, but people were very excited about it around the Xbox 360 era and the introduction of the Kinect. And it was essentially a kind of a game where you were able to play with a sort of a virtual child that had very realistic interactions with you. And it never did anything other than incredibly controlled demos, right? I think people had these massive, crazy ideas about what it was going to actually do. My prediction is basically that. I think that this is the decade where we are going to be able to speak to an NPC in a computer game and have them speak back to us in a conversation that resembles an actual human conversation without it necessarily being 100% pre-written. I'm not saying that they're going to be able to, I'm not saying they're going to be alive or anything like that, but I think they're going to be able to imitate a reasonable approximation of a human conversation much better than they can today.
So you're saying neural net in games, not Turing test in games.
Right. Yes. I do not think we're going to be talking about, the rights for video game Americans yet, but we're going to be talking about this game has a really great simulation of a person.
Reagan, we've been talking about rights for video game Americans this entire decade. You just haven't been paying attention.
Yes, that's true. Well, rise up, gamers. And 2020 is the year when we rise up.
Rise up to do what?
to game. Come on.
Rise up to play Ring Fit Adventure.
Yes, which Shane and I have been playing a lot of and probably will be doing either a Patreon or a full episode. Stay tuned.
I can't wait to talk about that.
I'm excited to hear you guys talk about it. And I need somebody to talk me into it because I'm now fat. So thank you guys for joining me on this.
You're not fat.
Listeners, I'm looking at this skinny motherfucker and he's not fat.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that encouragement.
Reagan just wanted some compliments at the end of the decade. Don't we all want some compliments?
Listeners, if
Shane,
you'd like to tell Reagan he's not fat, you can find him on Twitter. Reagan, where can they find you?
Yes. So listeners, you can find our show on the web at theshortgame.net or, of course, on Patreon at patreon.com/theshortgame. And once again, all of our Patreon supporters get instant access to our Discord, which is where these conversations start. So we'd love to have you there. And you can support us at $1 a month or more. And of course, you can find our show on Twitter at _shortgame. And you can find me on Twitter at Reagan K. That's RAYGANK. Laura, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Laura J. Nash.
And Shane, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at 8BitShane.
And thank you for listening to The Short Game. Gamers Rise Up.